Hey, it's Professor Grabowski. And for our very first lesson, I want to talk about, quite simply, what is newswriting? Because if you haven't done journalism before or taken a journalism course, you might have some misconceptions about what exactly journalism, and in particular newswriting, are. And that's very understandable because your understanding of journalism probably comes from pop culture, from things like movies and TV shows. But the thing is, Hollywood has kind of created a lot of false stereotypes about journalists. So you can see on the screen, I have clips here, photos from a few different prominent films about journalists. And while these are really entertaining films, and I enjoyed them, they do a horrendous job of representing what journalism is. So in the first example, going counterclockwise, in the top left corner, we have Amy Schumer's film Trainwreck, in which she gets involved romantically with one of her sources and does a lot of other ethically questionable things. And below that, we have Chris Rock's and Rosario Dawson's rom-com, Top 5, in which the journalist is very misleading and also gets romantically involved with her source. And then we have Jake Gyllenhaal's Nightcrawler film, in which he plays a photojournalist, but he works for a tabloid, and he actually ends up sort of fabricating his photos. He sort of stages them. He even kills people in the film. So, of course, you definitely don't want to be like Jake Gyllenhaal if you're a journalist. And then finally, we have Spider-Man, which is based on the comic book. And he ends up basically reporting on himself, right? Because he reports stories on Spider-Man, and, well, he's Spider-Man, of course. So as a journalist, you want to be keeping yourself out of the story. Your job is to be an objective observer. You don't want to actually become the news. Another reason why I think there's a lot of confusion and misunderstanding about journalism is because the media is such a sort of broad, nebulous concept. So journalists are part of the media, but not all media is journalism. So we've got all these different sort of news organizations, bloggers, and other people who get lumped under the umbrella of journalism, but they're not necessarily all journalists. So when I talk about journalism, I mean like daily newspapers, like the New York Times, like local newspapers such as the Queen Courier. I mean network TV news such as CBS Evening News, broadcast radio news such as NPR. Because these organizations have standards. They have certain best practices they use to ensure that they're reporting on information truthfully and accurately. And of course, they make mistakes, but they also have practices in place to correct those mistakes. However, the thing about being a journalist is, well, anyone can be a journalist. In the United States, because of the First Amendment, we have press freedom. So you don't need a license to actually practice journalism. Anyone can call themselves a journalist. So anyone can start a blog and say, I'm a journalist. But as a result, you get a lot of people doing journalism who necessarily aren't really well trained, and who don't really have integrity. And as a result, they're publishing things that sometimes are just outright false, and that damages the press's reputation, because you have all these people being lumped in under the umbrella of media. But When I talk about journalism, I'm talking about trained professionals, like people at the major news outlets. Now, of course, even people at the major news outlets, like network TV and the New York Times, have come under fire because they make mistakes. And in some cases, they engage in outright fabrications or plagiarism or serious scandals. That gives the profession a black eye. So that's why it's important, if you're going to do journalism, that you adhere by a few really basic standards. And these standards are what really separates journalism from other types of writing. And we're going to discuss them in more detail. So the three major elements of journalism are truthfulness, accuracy, and objectivity. So let's talk about each of these in turn. These things matter because it's a journalist's top priority to report and write honestly. You have an implied contract with your audience. You're asking them to trust you, to check that what you're saying is true, and that your overall account isn't misleading. So first, truthfulness. Journalism's main objective is to tell the truth. Now, it's not truth in the absolute or philosophical or scientific sense, but rather a pursuit of the truths by which we can operate on a day-to-day basis. Journalism is sometimes called the first rough draft of history. But when we talk about truthfulness, what that means is we report on reality as it is, not as we want it to be. So we don't write fiction. We don't write fabrication, right? So fiction and fabrication are where we make up things. We don't even exaggerate, because exaggeration is not really telling the full truth. So in order to tell the truth, what that means is we have to gather the facts and verify that they're accurate, and then convey that information into a fair and balanced way. So how do we go about gathering information? Well, quite simply, what that means is you go out into the world and observe what's happening. You talk to sources. Sources are people, good sources are people who have firsthand knowledge or expertise on a topic, people who have participated in or witnessed an event you're covering. So, for example, if you have to go and cover a traffic accident, God forbid, you might talk to the victims who were involved in the accident. You might talk to witnesses, and you would also probably talk to police and get their report on what happened. If you were to report on, let's say, something at school, let's say you go and cover a speech, well, you would go and cover and see what the speaker says, and then you'd also go and see what the audience's reaction is. You might talk to them afterwards. Or if you were to do a more enterprising story, like, for example, in the spring 2020 semester, during the whole COVID-19 pandemic, there were some students who got stuck on campus. So after the university closed and courses went online and people left the residence halls, there were still about 50 students who couldn't go home. In most cases because they lived out of the country and they weren't able to get flights home. So the university had to take care of those students and provide for them, make sure they had meals and things like that. So if you were to write a story about that, you'd want to talk to, of course, the students who were stuck on campus. You'd also want to talk to the staff who was assisting them and to the administrators. Those would kind of be the credible sources to talk to. You wouldn't want to go and talk to just some random student who was already at home, because they really wouldn't know what was going on and what those students were going through and what the university was dealing with them. That wouldn't be a credible source. But the students who were involved with that situation and the staff and administrators who were assisting them, they would have firsthand knowledge of that situation, so you'd want to talk to them. Now, when you're talking to sources, you want to interview them directly. You don't want to just get the information from them secondhand. You want to speak to them and get the information directly from them to make sure it's accurate. That's what they said. And you want to interview people ideally in person. If you go and talk to a person face to face, you can see their body language, how they're reacting. It's more personal. It's a better way to kind of build rapport and gain an understanding of them. But of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, that may not be possible. You need to be careful about your health. So in that situation, you could go and conduct your interviews remotely, via email or video chat or something like that. Your health should come first. And, a lot of times journalists go and do interviews just over the telephone or over video chat. It's nice if you can talk to a person face to face. I think it's more revealing. You can learn more about them. But a lot of journalism is just done remotely. So in this course, while we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, you can absolutely do your interviews remotely. You don't need to put your health at risk and go and talk to a person in person. One thing you want to avoid, though, is using anonymous sources. You want to provide the full names of your sources, so not just their first name, but their first and last name, and their details, like where they're from, what their qualifications or title are. And the reason we do that is for transparency, so the reader understands, well, who's providing the information? Are they a credible source? Are they an expert? And can I trust the information that's coming from them? So that's why we want to be fully transparent about who our sources are and avoid anonymous sources. Anonymous sources rarely are necessary. I mean, unless you're reporting on something top secret involving, the CIA or something like that, you typically don't need to use an anonymous source. Sometimes sources won't want to speak to you or provide their names. That's fine. That's their right. But if someone doesn't want to speak to you on the record, then just find someone else who's willing to speak to you on the record. Now, what constitutes a usable source? I mean, conceivably, anyone can be a source, but you don't necessarily want to use anyone. What you want to use is a person who's an authority or an expert on the subject you're writing about. If it's not obvious that the person is an expert, you want to help the reader understand why he or she is an expert. So if you're writing a story, for example, about the students who were trapped on campus, you'd want to explain, John Smith was one of the students who's trapped on campus because he can't go back home to England, and here's what he has to say. You wouldn't want to just say, John Smith said this. You'd want to explain to the reader, well, who is this guy? Why is he relevant? Okay, so that's how we get at truthfulness. We get at truthfulness by going out into the world and talking to people and finding out what happened. We don't just make up stuff. We go out and get the information. But the thing is, it's not just enough to get the information. We must also ensure that it's correct, and that's where accuracy comes in. There's an old saying in journalism, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. It's kind of a joke, right? But you get the point. The point is that you shouldn't take anything for granted. You should always double check. So just because something sounds good or looks right, that doesn't mean it is. So you want to do things like double check the spellings of all names, especially these days, right? People spell their names all kinds of different ways. My name is Mark. I spell it M-A-R-K, but there's people who spell it with a C. I once even met a person who spelled it with a C and a K. So you don't want to assume things. You want to double check. Same goes for dates, for numbers, for quotes, everything. You want to double check and make sure you got it accurate. If you're quoting someone, for example, and you leave out one word, such as no or not, that can completely change the meaning of the quote. So you want to make sure it's accurate. You don't want to assume anything. Of course, you don't want to make up information, and you don't want to embellish. So embellish is when we exaggerate something. I remember a few semesters ago, there was a student who wrote a story. It was a really good story, and she eventually got it published, but initially she had a minor issue with it. She wrote that she was writing about an Adelphi student who was playing professional basketball in Europe, and she said, less than 1% of all college players go on to play professionally. And that sounds accurate, right? I mean, how many professional players do you know? It's not easy to become a professional basketball player. But the thing is, it's actually not true. So the NCAA publishes statistics on how many former college players go on to play professionally. And between the WNBA and playing overseas in Europe and other places, it's actually about 5% of former college basketball players who go on to play professionally. So you don't want to just say something that seems right. You need to double check everything. Remember that old saying, if your mother says she loves you, check it out, verify it. Objectivity. So we strive to be objective. So we don't want to, it's not just enough to gather the information and try to be accurate. We also need to be objective. And the thing is, it's really hard to be objective as a human, right? Because no one is free of bias. We all have our own biases. Sometimes we're not even aware of them, right? There's implicit biases. But the thing is, as much as possible, we want to try to be aware of our biases and avoid them. So, for example, if you feel really passionate about a topic, right, then you should probably avoid writing about it because your bias might slip into the story. Sometimes it can slip into stories in ways you don't even think about. If you're really aware of your bias, you might overcompensate and end up being biased against your bias. And one time I had to go and cover a high school basketball game. When I was in college, I used to, over my breaks, write for my local newspaper. And they asked me to cover my high school, my alma mater. They were playing in a holiday tournament, and they didn't have anyone else to cover it. So I did, and after I submitted the story, I asked the editor, he was aware that I went to high school there, did you think it was biased or whatever? Was it okay? And he said, well, I had to change it because actually it was biased against your high school. What had happened was I was so worried about being biased against the other school that I overcompensated. It was biased against my own high school. So it's best to avoid those conflicts of interest. So, for example, if you're writing a story about the election and you're working on the political campaign for one of the candidates, that's a conflict of interest. It's going to be hard for you to write an election story and be completely objective. So you should probably just find something else to write about. Now, one method we use as journalists to try to reduce our objectivity is to talk to both sides. Sometimes we have to talk to like 5 different sides, right? Sometimes issues are very nuanced and complicated, and it's not just a black and white issue. There's many gray areas. So you want to talk to both sides. You also want to give anyone in your story who's sort of criticized a chance to defend themselves. It's a matter of fairness. Let's say you're doing a story on the food in the school cafeteria, right? And you think it's awful. And a lot of students you talk to think it's awful. Well, you want to, first of all, try to find other people who believe this food is actually good. And trust me, if you look hard enough, you'll find some students who like the cafeteria food. But you also, more importantly, need to give the people who work in the school cafeteria a chance to defend themselves. I mean, imagine if someone said something bad about you. You'd want to have a chance to defend yourself, right? So it's a matter of basic fairness. If someone's criticized, we need to give them a chance to respond. Otherwise, your story will be one-sided and unfair. Remember to stick to the facts. That's one way you can help ensure that you're being objective and not subjective. Now, there are some forms of journalism, such as if you're a columnist or an editorial writer. Sports, to an extent, allows some opinion that do allow journalists to express their opinions. But news writing does not, and this is a news writing class. News writing is just about reporting the news, which means sticking to the facts, getting information from reliable sources, and attributing all opinions to qualified sources. You want to keep yourself out of the story. As a news reporter, your job is to be an objective observer on the sidelines. The story is not about you. So you want to do things like write in third person, never in first person. You also want to avoid editorializing, which is not acceptable in news writing. All opinions in your story must be attributed to qualified sources. Remember, the story is not about you. No one cares about your personal feelings or thoughts. You're not writing a first-person essay. You're not blogging for thoughtcatalog.com or some other blog. In order to be a journalist, particularly a news writer, you must be interested in more than just your own feelings. You must want to know about the world that exists outside your own head. Now, be aware, opinion can sneak into stories. Not only in obvious words, like if you're calling something good or bad, or similar expressions of approval or disapproval, but it can also sneak into stories through characterizations, usually adjectives or adverbs. So watch out for words like many, few, usually, important, effective, etc. Because people can disagree over what it means. Let me give you an example. The phrase many students might mean something very different to you than to someone else. So instead of writing many students attended the speech, say every seat in the 610 capacity auditorium was filled and more than 100 more people watched on a video monitor in the lobby. Because the thing is, if you say many people attended a speech, well, how many is many? Right? For you, it might mean 100. For someone else, it might mean 1,000. Similarly, if you say someone is tall, well, if you're 5'2", someone who's 6 feet tall might seem tall. But if you're playing in the NBA, 6 feet tall is short. So that's why it's better to use concrete terms and say the person's 6'5" or 6'2", so the reader can decide for themselves whether that person's tall. Another example, instead of writing that a car was driving fast, tell us how fast it was driving. Finding out the specifics, of course, takes effort and ingenuity, but, journalism's not for lazy people. Striving to be objective also means avoiding conflicts of interest. Remember, your obligation is to the public. It's to inform the public. It's not to make your source look good. That's public relations. It's also not covering something because someone paid you to. That's bribery. Don't cover people you're related to, even if they're just your cousin or uncle. Don't cover people you're romantically involved with, or good friends with, or who you live with. Also avoid covering people who have authority over you, such as a current professor or your coach or your boss. It's just going to be impossible for you to write about them in a purely objective way. And even if you're able to, there's still going to be a perception that, well, maybe you were biased. So you want to avoid those situations. So you might be wondering, well, geez, if I can't write about people who I know really well, who am I supposed to write about? Well, you got to go out and talk to strangers. Journalists do it every day, and you can do it too. Now, when you're tracking down sources and trying to get information from them, It's not always easy. People don't always respond to your emails right away. They don't return your phone calls. So you need to be dogged. Don't just email someone and wait to hear back. If you don't hear back from them after a couple days, send another email. And if you don't hear back from them, call them or even go to their office. If they don't want to talk to you, then find someone else to interview. It's important not to be passive in news gathering. Information won't magically land on your lap. If it did, journalism would be a super easy job and everyone would want to do it. But good reporting takes effort. Now, let's talk about writing style. So there's a few things about news writing that are different than other forms of writing. So let's talk about some of those things and some of the guidelines you should follow. We'll be talking about this throughout the semester, of course, but this talk is sort of just a preview of some of the ways that journalism, news writing, is different from other types of writing. First, you always want to write in third person, never in first person. So third person involves using pronouns like he, she, they. First person is when you refer to yourself, like I, me, mine. So because news writing is about writing about other people and your role is to just be an objective observer, you should always be writing in third person. He did this, she said that, they did that. You should never refer to yourself. She told me this, or I met with so-and-so and found her to be very friendly. All right. So you want to keep yourself out of the story because the story is not about you. Also, when you're writing your stories, make sure you write in appropriate tense. Usually that means writing in past tense because the things you're writing about will have already happened. All right. Don't use big words. You want to use strong words and concrete words, but not big words. So don't, bust out your thesaurus and try to impress me with some, super long word that I'd see on an SAT exam. Remember, journalism's about writing for the masses. It's a form of mass communication. The average person only has like a 10th grade reading level. So, you want to write in fairly colloquial terms. The average person only has about 600 words they use on a daily basis. So if you find yourself using words that you don't normally use, make sure you look it up in a dictionary and ensure that it means what you think it means. I always find, students commonly misuse words in their stories. So double checks, words that you use that you don't normally use. Go to dictionary.com. Also avoid writing cliches. Presumably you're writing about people and things because they're newsworthy, which means that they're unique and interesting. So you don't want to trivialize that person by using common expressions to describe them. Some other things, you want to avoid semicolons. In my experience, 99% of students misuse semicolons. The other thing is if you're using a semicolon, your sentence is probably super long, and you want to avoid super long sentences in journalism. Those are also known as run-on sentences. So anytime your sentence gets to be 25 words or longer, I would say you're in danger of writing a run-on sentence. Even if the story is grammatically correct, at a certain point, it becomes so long that it's difficult for a reader to digest and make sense of. So you want to avoid writing sentences that are longer than 25 words because that's really getting into run-on sentence territory. You also want to avoid things like the Oxford and serial comma. So we'll talk about that more when we talk about Associated Press style. And after each sentence, you only want to have one space, not two. Finally, remember that journalism is not free writing. It's a profession, or at least a craft. And like any craft, the work one does is produced within the confines of a certain framework. And it's that framework that students must learn if they are to succeed in the course or work as a journalist. It's kind of like if I give you a ball and I say, go and play with this ball. Well, if I tell you to play basketball with it, right, then you can dribble the ball, you can shoot it, you can pass it. But if I tell you to play soccer with it, then it's a whole set of different rules, right? You can kick the ball, but you can't actually touch it with your hand because in soccer, that's considered a handball, which is a penalty. Similarly in basketball, you don't want to kick the ball, you want to just use your hand. So it's the same thing with news writing. There are certain kind of constraints that we face with news writing that we don't have in other forms of writing and vice versa. All right. Couple more things you should be aware of. These are some important terms that will come up during the semester, which are unique to news writing. One is a story. So when I talk about your stories, right, like you have to write a profile story, an enterprise story, a breaking news story. This is like a particular article. Sometimes it's also called a piece. So that's what a story is. It's the assignments you'll be doing in this class, where you cover something and write about it. All right. When I use the term pitch, what that is, it's your idea for a story and the details about it. So, for example, for your profile story, you'll pick someone interesting and newsworthy to write about, and you'll send me an email where you pitch your story idea. You'll tell me who you want to write about and why this person is newsworthy. That's a pitch. The term headline, what that is, that's the title of your story. All right. Byline, that's the name of the person who wrote the story. So when you write your articles, you'll want to include under the headline your name. That's your byline, so that I know you wrote the story. When we refer to the lead in a story, what that is, it's the beginning of a story. Usually it's just the first few sentences. Sometimes it's just one sentence, but it's the beginning part of the story, and it's arguably the most important, right? You know what people say about first impressions, how it's important to make a first impression. It's the same thing in journalism. Readers will decide based on your lead whether they want to read the rest of the story or go and read something else. So your lead is a really important part of your story. You want to hook the reader in the beginning. Otherwise, they'll jump ship and stop reading. Sources is a term you should already be familiar with. Those are the people you interview for your stories. Sources can also sometimes be non-people. They can be things like documents or websites. A beat is a reporter's assigned area. So, for example, if you're a sports reporter, your beat might be the baseball team or the New York Mets, or the hockey team, the New York Islanders. If you're a news reporter, your beat might be city council or police and crime, or it might be education. Newsroom, that is the place where journalists do journalism. So it's usually a room, and that's where journalists do their business. It's their office. Okay, so that's kind of a brief introduction to what news writing is and how it's different from other types of writing. We'll be going more in depth into these concepts later in the semester, but just wanted to give you an overview of what news writing is all about.